Hello, I hope you can hear me. I can see my slides there, so that's a good start. Welcome to this talk, which is focused really on child poverty in Victorian Scotland. I'm a lecturer here in the history department, and I'm particularly interested in modern Scottish history, but very much kind of Scotland within a broader context as well. And my specialty is the history of children, and my research really has focused particularly on the Ragged School, which we'll hear a tiny little bit about today, not too much. I'm trying not to let that take over. So there will be mention of the Ragged Schools. But I'm delighted to be doing this talk. I think it's always fun to be able to talk about something relatively broad-ranging, and so I was delighted to have this invitation today. And I very much look forward to any questions or comments that you might have. Okay, so just a broad overview here of the kind of structure that I'm going to be following for this talk today. So opening, thinking a little bit about understanding children as historical subjects, and then thinking, putting that into context, really thinking about changing attitudes towards children over the Victorian particularly, and then moving to think about the problem of child poverty and Scottish responses to this. So I think there's a bit of a story to be told here, so I hope you find it engaging and interesting. So just thinking about the place of children within history, children have comprised a vast proportion of societies historically. So writing particularly with regard to Britain, Carolyn Steedman has argued that the nation was, and I quote, awash with children during this period, during particularly the 19th century she's writing with reference to. And when we're talking about Scotland in particular, under 14s comprised a third of society in 1900. So we're talking about big numbers here, and it's not hard really to surmise that given their prominence and visibility within society, that this should, or they should, be reflected within historical camps as well. The second point here really is about what children and what history is based on children can add to understanding. Back in the 1960s, 1970s, we had emerging women's history, and histories of women tell us so much more than just about female experiences as opposed to male experiences. For instance, women's history has opened up understanding with regards to the economy, the workplace, local and national politics, as well as, of course, to gender roles and to the domestic sphere as well. Similarly, I would suggest that children bring new insights about the societies of which they were a part. Here we have a quotation from James Martin that I think is quite helpful. Childhood is where you catch a culture in high relief. So for Martin here, beliefs about childhood as well as children's lived experiences really act as something of a barometer of their culture. The way that children are treated offers an insight into perhaps a culture's priorities, particularly with regard to most obviously to welfare and to family life. The way that children are reared, so for instance, the discipline that's used or that is not used, the place of play, access to education, all of these matters speak to a society's fundamental beliefs about human nature and the value of individuals. Really, the notion that the experiences of children convey something bigger about a society is not something that the Victorians would have objected to. Certainly, the presence of visible child poverty and concerns about child prostitution or criminality, these issues were regarded as a shameful blight on an otherwise advanced and proud nation. We're going to be looking at some of the responses to the issue of child poverty during this short talk today. But just beginning with a bit of context here, the broader backdrop as to ideas about children and childhood during this period, this really was a period of real substantial change in how children and childhood were regarded. So certainly the late 18th and the early 19th century saw the emergence and the eventual dominance of the idea of the cult of the child. We see almost an objectification of children that's evidenced in literature, in art, in consumer goods during this period. We see the child, and certainly the middle class child, as almost a sanctified character. The image here from Joshua Reynolds really encapsulates this. It's entitled The Age of Innocence, and this image was reproduced endlessly on a vast scale during this period. By the end of the 19th century, there were over 300 full-scale copies of this image. The enlightened philosopher John Locke, his focus on the child's malleability, he argued that children were like wax, or that they were born as a blank slate. This would prove highly influential during the 18th century, the late 17th, 18th century. And this represented a marked and significant change from the earlier focus on original sin and the need to correct and the duty to correct and to tame children. This understanding also underscored the vulnerability of children to their surroundings and their influences, surrounding influences. And as such, we see the emergence in the 19th century of the concept of a protected childhood, that children should be sheltered from the dangers of the world within a loving and affectionate family. But building upon John Locke's ideas, we see the emergence of Jean-Jacques Rousseau in the 18th century and his ideas about childhood that he would articulate in Emile. And I see that I haven't added in the year there. I believe it was translated to English in 1762, but do correct me if I'm wrong. But yeah, so we have late 18th century here for Emile. And within this extremely influential publication, Rousseau advocated essentially for the purity and the innocence of children. So while before him, Locke had been talking about children as a blank slate, we have an even further shift away from the concept of original sin in Rousseau's writing, when he talks about actually children as actively innocent. They are not neutral, they are innocent, and stressing childhood as the pinnacle of life, as a distinct stage in and of itself. So the child is not an adult in development. The child is a being in and of themselves. And you can see these quotations here from Rousseau. So for instance, everything is good as it leaves the hands of the author of things. Everything degenerates in the hands of man. And then this lovely quotation here, let childhood ripen in your children. So we really have this idea that actually children should enjoy childhood. They shouldn't necessarily read children's literature that's intended to create moral beings, that's intended to create good citizens. They should actually read for enjoyment, this kind of idea. And certainly we see the romantic poets such as Wordsworth and Blake. They build upon Rousseau, and they actively stress the concept of the natural goodness of children. So the child as a good influence within society. So we often see this kind of image of the wise child. David, in a Scottish context, David Allen's family portraiture provides a really excellent example of how romantic ideas of children and childhood were translated in practice. So Nell Whiting, who's an art historian, she suggests that the influence of Rousseau is really evident in these images here. Allen's work here really represents an important break with earlier examples of family portraiture. So unlike previously, we see the children depicted as notably different from adults. If you kind of look at older images of children within families, I'm thinking particularly 17th century, earlier in the 18th century, you see children as little adults, both in terms of proportion and in terms of clothing, and it's often very kind of static. But here we see the emergence of a very different being. The children and the adults are very different physically, in terms of proportions, in terms of dress. The clothing that the children are wearing is designed to allow for movement. And we see children playing, we see playfulness and mischievousness in these images. Whiting's argument here is further strengthened by the fact that the Duchess of Atholl, who we can see on the left-hand image, who commissioned this painting from Alan, she had corresponded with her sister and discussed the advantages of Rousseau's thought with regard to children and childhood, and conveyed something of her enthusiasm for Rousseau's Emile. Now, such fanciful and idealized depictions of childhood were, however, confronted very much by the experiences of poor and working class children who felt the full force of urbanization. Now, of course, there is this concurrent story about Scottish childhoods happening here simultaneously. So while we've got these emerging romanticizing ideas about childhood happening in the late 18th and early 19th century, we see Britain at the forefront of the Industrial Revolution, dubbed the workshop of the world, of course, that popular phrase attributed to Britain. This period really witnesses exponential growth in production. So, for instance, in 1830, Britain produced 650,000 tons of iron annually, and within 20 years, this would reach 1 million tons. So it's a period of vast, massive growth. Child labour, of course, was not an invention of the Industrial Revolution. Working class and poor children had always been economically active members of their households. They started work as soon as their parents could find an appropriate form of employment. The decision for a child to work might be made more urgent, of course, in times of particular hardship. For instance, if the male breadwinner was incapacitated or was absent. But prior to the industrialization, work generally was taken on according to ability rather than age. So, for instance, in rural areas, very young children might be responsible for scaring the birds away from crops, perhaps collecting water, maybe caring for animals. So essentially, we saw children helping where they could, but tasks that were beyond their strength or understanding would not be taken on by children ordinarily. This, of course, would change with the industrialization. So while children may have performed work under the guidance of a parent or a family member, working in an industrial context was really quite different. So factories and mines offered simple work, much of which required small hands or small bodies to accomplish it. So tasks ideally suited to children. Roles especially suited to children were found in abundance. So, scavengers within the textile industry. This would involve crawling beneath machinery and removing anything that might disturb the mechanisms, or trappers operating coal mine doors. So in this regard, the drastic increase in child labour is perhaps not a surprising phenomenon. Children's employment, of course, could prove highly dangerous. Hospital reports detail the vicious injuries that children could and did sustain. Piecemeal legislation was introduced intermittently throughout the 19th century with regard to child labour, with each act amending or overriding the ones that had came before. But it was really not until the passing of the Factory and the Workshop Act in 1878 that we see legislation effectively restricting children's work across all ages and industry. And this legislation effectively marks out the bounds of childhood, defining in law when a child becomes an adult, when independence becomes acceptable. Now, the industrialization cast a long and dark shadow. Urbanization and mass migration, of course, led to economic and social crises. cities expanded prolifically with little supporting infrastructure. Certainly in Scotland, both the Highland clearances and mass Irish migration in light of the potato famine led to crippling overcrowding. Now, overcrowding was a particularly Scottish problem, with Scottish tenement buildings being ill-suited to the rising population. And according to the 1861 census, 34% of Scottish homes at this point had one room, and 1% had no windows. And 1% feels quite large to me when we're talking about not having any windows. By the time of the First World War in 1914, 45% of the Scottish population lived in housing that was categorised as overcrowded. By comparison, in England, this figure stood at 7%. So 45 to 7%. Now, these statistics testify to the fact that cramped living conditions were really the normality to a vast proportion of Scots. Poor living conditions, however, were not confined to cities. Scotland's black houses often comprised one room that was often shared with animals and had little to no natural light. Now, the image that you can see here, taken in 1925, does include windows, as you can see. But this, as I say, was not always the case, certainly with black houses. I think this image is a really evocative one. I'm not sure how well you can see it on the slide here. But to have an image from as late as 1925 like this, I think is quite compelling. You can see the children here. You can vaguely see that they're barefooted outside of the black house here. Now, such dwellings caused considerable concern among the middle class. You can see on the left-hand side here a news article detailing plans to destroy by fire several hundreds of the black houses on the Isle of Harris for sanitary reasons. So, of course, we're talking here about Harris, and the image here is from Barra. So there were very real concerns about the condition of these houses during this period. We've got worries about privacy, modesty, the possibility, the potential of incest, one of these things that was often a concern of the Victorians, a practice that was thought to be rife among the poorest. And certainly the concerns about sanitation expressed here were not unfounded. The poor's living conditions certainly had a detrimental impact on the health of residents, and especially upon children. An absence of light, which of course is a problem within black houses. Absence of light, of course, is associated with rickets. It's noteworthy that the children admitted to hospital in Glasgow with rickets predominantly lived within one-bedroomed homes. Now, the 20th century sees a marked change in the prominence of rickets, largely due to the improvement in housing and better medical provision. So in 1910, we have 9% of children in Glasgow with rickets, which is huge, and this would fall to 0.3% by 1950. Another danger that children faced within their homes, and particularly within black houses, is that of open fires. These posed a very real danger to children. And of course, also overcrowding that I've mentioned several times now would lead to local epidemics of diseases such as cholera, TB, typhus, and smallpox. And it was children who were hit the hardest during spates of illness. So, for instance, in 1911, the year of King George V's accession, 54.7% of deaths in Glasgow were infants and children under the age of 15, and half of that number were under the age of 5. Now, it was not unheard of for the poor's housing to prove structurally unsound. When a tenement collapsed unexpectedly in Edinburgh's Old Town shortly after 1 a.m. on the 24th of November 1861, 35 people were killed or fatally injured. Now, newspapers across Britain provided substantial coverage of the dreadful catastrophe, as they called it, within the Scottish capital. Now, children and young people featured prominently in the newspaper coverage. Young people were certainly counted amongst the dead. So, for instance, we have 2-year-old Agnes Irvine and her 2-month-old sister Catherine, who died along their parents and maternal grandmother. Yet, actually, the disproportionate number of children spared in this incident was commented on extensively. Certainly, given the prominence of orphanhood within Victorian culture, its depiction within literature, I'm sure we can all think of literary orphans from the 19th century, it's unsurprising that newspaper accounts indulged in detailed descriptions of children who were orphaned by the disaster. The British periodical John Bull provided an account of one such child, describing a young boy aged about 6 or 7 years old who was taken from the ruins, and I quote, while asleep 5 hours after the accident. Now, this unexpected outcome was attributed to the thick beam that was lying athwart his cot, which ensured that his sleep was undisturbed. From census data, it seems that perhaps this child in question was 8-year-old James Bruce. Now, the most infamous anecdote, if you're familiar with this episode, the most infamous anecdote here was reiterated in numerous newspapers, was that of a young boy who would encourage the men pulling him from the rubble, shouting, "Heave away, my lads, I'm no dead yet." And I've not mentioned the pictures here in the slide. The large image here is of the kind of recovery effort amidst the rubble. So this is Paisley Close that had collapsed on the Royal Mile in Edinburgh. Now, the boy in question, the boy who had encouraged his rescuers to continue heaving away, was 12-year-old Joseph MacIver. Now, at the time of the disaster, MacIver was boarding with the McCluskey family within Paisley Close, and he would go on to be tasked with identifying the bodies of the entire family and their servant. He became somewhat immortalized. Those words of encouragement were really taken hold of by the public, and 6 months after the disaster, Joseph was photographed in preparation for the creation of a bust of his head, which you can see here, which is still available on the Royal Mile above the kind of rebuilt building there at Paisley Close in honour of MacIver. And you can see a decorative scroll carrying his memorable words. You can't really see it terribly well here, but heave away chaps, notably anglicised here, I'm no dead yet. Now, children such as MacIver represented hope to a grieving city, speaking to their devastation, with many orphaned in the disaster. This was a chief motivation for an overhaul within the city, with the appointment of the city's first medical officer for health shortly after this episode. Now, with the middle class increasingly separated from the poor, as symbolised in the growth of Edinburgh's new town in the late 18th century, there was a growing uneasiness as to both the condition in poor districts and the immoral behaviour of inhabitants. Now, Seth Coven has explored the phenomenon of so-called slumming in Victorian London, in which the comfortable classes toured the most poverty-stricken areas of the city. Now, slumming was used as a verb. It was an activity that might be associated with either charity, education, or perhaps entertainment. Critiquing this practice, Coven suggests that it encouraged so-called slummers to trivialise poverty or to utilise this activity for amusement. Now, such practices were certainly not confined to London. Rather, these practices were often a tool employed by charities and philanthropists that sought to draw in the Victorian public. The popular interest in the experiences of the poor mean it is not difficult to find accounts of Scotland's impoverished slums. Edinburgh's wine certainly attracted social commentators who recognised and fed into this curiosity and interest of their middle-class audience. So we can see here some extracts from a piece by George Bell, which he wrote in 1850, and he was the secretary to Thomas Guthrie's Ragged School that we will talk about in a few moments' time. And you can see here the stress he is placing on his readers visiting the sites he's describing personally. It's only by personally visiting, descending, as he says, and seeing the existence of the poor, that people can speak with any authority as to the experiences of the poor. Now, such language needs to be understood within its broader cultural and literary context. Of course, the 19th century has been deemed the age of societies. Charities are competing for every pound. The seemingly exotic and dangerous activities of overseas missionaries certainly drew a crowd. David Livingstone's Missionary Travels, published in 1857, would be an immediate hit with the general public, selling out of its initial pre-run before its publication. And certainly evangelical Christians were quick to adopt the language of overseas mission and apply it to a social context. And of course, that popular phrase here, charity begins at home, was something hammered home quite frequently by evangelical philanthropists. Quick definition of what we mean when we're talking about evangelicalism. The great historian of evangelicalism, David Bebbington, would identify the evangelical through four main qualities. So that is a focus on the Bible, a belief in the atoning work of Christ, the necessity of conversion, and finally the importance of activism. Hence the prominence of philanthropy from within this community. To them, the existence of such poverty and immorality, which was associated so closely with poverty in this period, so drunkenness, sexual immorality, and so forth, this was a source of national shame to all who professed to be Christian. Oh, I apologize, I left a slide there. Children received particular attention in accounts of slum conditions. Impoverished slum childhood sat in stark contrast with the increasingly prominent depiction of the protected childhood centered on play that I discussed earlier. Descriptions often played on this contrast. So you can see here these words from Thomas Guthrie's Out of Harness. Their infants have no toys. Mother's smiles are rare as sunshine. Now, such accounts stressed the poor child's status as a victim. They were, to use Lucinda Platt's words, they were first a child and they poor second. A very particular image of working class parents emerges by the mid-19th century, running parallel with the increasingly influential domestic ideology of the middle class. So in contrast with the steadfast and reliable provider, we see the brutal and the work-shy father who beats his children while simultaneously failing to provide. Similarly, we see the mother who is the opposite of the house-proud mother. We see one who is feckless, too fond of drink, and incompetent at keeping a home. Now, while previously the notion of intervening with the home was unthinkable, children were regarded as a possession of their parents, really, with their rights secondary to those of their parents. From the mid-19th century, we see a distinct shift. The notion that children are vulnerable and need protection leads to a change in attitudes towards parenting. Parents come to be seen as a caretaker rather than an owner. And this change is significant. And as a consequence, we see that intervention within inadequate homes becomes something of a moral necessity. Perhaps the most infamous initiative to intervene in the homes of ragged children and the poorest children is the Ragged School movement. Now, the London Ragged School Union was founded in 1844, and it united, I think, around 26 schools that already existed at that point. By 1846, we can see the growth of the movement here. We have 26 schools attended by 2,600. This would move on to 560 schools, just shy of 50,000 children by 1860. It should be noted that these schools were not limited to London, but were established across Britain, and we do have a strong association between the London Ragged Schools and Scottish figures. I should say at this point as well, these schools were free, they were gratuitous, and children were essentially qualified by their ragged appearance. Children were taught the 3 R's, so reading, writing, and arithmetic. But most important, of course, within the ragged school classroom was biblical teaching, the sharing of salvation, the salvation story. Despite a focus in scholarship on the schools that focused both by contemporaries and by later historians upon the English character of the movement, there was a healthy and active Scottish contingent. More than this, I would suggest, Scotland produced 2 leading figures whose influence I am going to turn to at this point. So thinking particularly about William Watson, Sheriff William Watson, and Guthrie in Edinburgh, Thomas Guthrie in Edinburgh. So here we have Watson of Aberdeen. No discussion of child poverty in Victorian Scotland or indeed Britain is complete without reference to Sheriff William Watson and his activities in Aberdeen. Watson is a key figure in local Scottish and British history. His work with Aberdeen's impoverished children would be credited as a major influence on reformatory and industrial institutions for poor and working class children, both across Britain and beyond. He was inspired by his evangelical brand of Christianity, and his efforts sought to reform and to reclaim the city's delinquent and semi-criminal youth, as he perceived them. Watson would take on the role of sheriff substitute in 1829, a position that he held for 37 years. He was particularly concerned about the rising crime rates in the city, and he aimed to stop what he perceived to be a steady decline into lawlessness among the youth. We've got very similar language, perhaps, in the modern day as well. Watson would open his first school in October in 1841. This was a school for boys between ages 8 and 14. The boys eligible were, and I quote, those of the poorest classes, and chiefly those who were found to infest our streets. So 109 boys were admitted within the institution's first 6 months. Now, Watson's work was tied up with his concern as to the vulnerability of children, particularly to criminality. So for Watson, poverty and crime stood in relation as cause to effect. The streets themselves were seen as a site of contamination that his institution sought to save children from. In his school, children received a basic education as well as basic industrial training. Now, of particular importance, the children received all of their meals from breakfast to dinner within the institution before returning home to their families at 8 p.m. The provision of food and the aim to keep families together represented a marked difference from practice elsewhere. This was provided gratuitously on the understanding that scholars would not engage in begging in the city's streets. Now, this would come to be known as the Aberdeen system, and it quickly attained a national reputation. The Bristol-based social reformer Mary Carpenter would draw extensively on Watson's Aberdeen institutions in her influential 1851 publication, Reformatory Schools. Now, Sheriff Watson's legacy would also feed into and inform the Ragged School movement in England. With the London Ragged School Union formed earlier in 1844, as I've said, just 3 years after Watson had established his school, his efforts were recognised early on by the London Ragged School Union's leadership. Now, although Watson was keen to retain his independence from the Ragged School movement, notably he expressed a very strong disdain for the term ragged in particular. He nevertheless spoke on Ragged School platforms in England, notably in Birmingham in 1861, and contributed regularly to their publications. He utilised his position to criticise the failure of English ragged schools to provide food for children, labelling this as, and I quote, altogether inadequate. Now, despite the London Ragged School Union's efforts being confined to the metropolis, to London, they nevertheless sought to engage in and foster a larger British enterprise. And the editors of the Ragged School magazine, which was produced in London, were at a pain to stress the importance of Scottish figures in the movement. So we see the second and third issues of the magazine featuring articles penned by Watson on his efforts in Aberdeen. And certainly in 1858, the magazine featured an article that claimed the movement was primarily commenced in Scotland, and that the Scotch have hitherto rather prided themselves on being foremost in the work. Now, despite, well, you can see here something of the recognition that we see within the London Ragged School Union's magazines. We see the Scottish schools cited as being fellow labourers to whom the English owe much. And of course, we cannot talk about the Ragged Schools without discussing Thomas Guthrie's efforts in Edinburgh. And he would really provide that crucial link between the Scottish and the English efforts to alleviate child poverty. He would come to be recognised as the apostle of the Ragged School movement. Now, having moved to Edinburgh from a rural parish in the early 1840s, Guthrie was deeply disturbed by the prevalence of child poverty in the city, and he would compose his 1847 plea for ragged schools in response to this. He drew explicitly on Watson, on Sheriff Watson's activities in Aberdeen, and in doing so, he stressed the interconnectedness of poverty and crime. Now, Guthrie has been credited with coining the term street Arab, which would go on to be a popular shorthand for the ragged street child. Now, of course, this term carries notable connotations of otherness, fitting snugly into the kind of overseas mission template that was discussed earlier. It's also an excellent example of the ambiguity that we see attached to the street child, the criminal in the bud, as Guthrie would also articulate. Historians interested in children have observed that the children of the poor in this period were simultaneously pitied and feared, that they were both a danger and in danger, and we see these ideas especially prominently within Guthrie's writing. Now, his plea for ragged schools within Edinburgh would stretch far beyond the city, garnering subscriptions from the likes of John Stuart Mill, the sitting Prime Minister Lord John Russell, as well as the future Prime Minister William Gladstone. But support was not confined to the well-to-do. We also see servants and household staff featuring prominently within subscription lists. The resulting institution that would come to be known as the Edinburgh Original Ragged School, following a schism in its first months, it would be a leading light of the Ragged School movement. And it would adopt much of Watson's practice in Aberdeen. So, as I say, forming that link between Aberdeen and the English Ragged School movement. He would build on Watson's practice of keeping children within their homes, as well as feeding children. Now, Guthrie himself would be a leading voice. His extensive writing on the subject of child poverty in general generated a sizable and international following. He would speak from platforms of the Evangelical Alliance in Europe, as well as the US, and maintain correspondence with regard to ragged schools in Jamaica. Certainly his authority on the subject of juvenile delinquency was recognised in 1853 when he was summoned to London to speak to the House of Commons on the issue of juvenile delinquency. It is not possible, however, to talk about the experiences of and provisions for impoverished children in Scotland without touching upon the issue of child emigration. Now, child emigration had been a solution for unwanted children and criminal children in the 18th century. Of course, we see criminal and nuisance children sent to North America before 1776, and then to Australia, Canada, and South Africa. This practice would cease in 1853, and we see narrative shift away from an emphasis on the child as a danger to the child in danger, in line with this focus on a protected childhood. And child emigration becomes seen as a solution to the dangers children face within urban dwellings and within corrupt and debased families. Certainly by the mid-19th century, child migration is resurrected by so-called child-saving societies across Britain, such as the Ragged Schools, as well as Thomas Bernardo's institutions. And these efforts are really framed as being in the child's best interests. Just to give a sense of the kind of the significance of child emigration here, we see Australia, Canada, and New Zealand all become destinations for child emigrants. Canada would be the main destination in the 19th century and the early 20th century, with the country receiving between 80 and 100,000 children between 1870 and 1930. And estimates suggest that just under 12% of Canada's population today are descended from child emigrants. But I should note that this is from Britain as a whole rather than just from Scotland. Now, of course, this vast misadventure, to put it mildly, can only be truly understood in the context of ideas about childhood and children that had evolved over this period. The natural innocence of children, their lack of agency, their vulnerability, their need to intervene on their behalf. For families and children themselves, emigration was often regarded as the lesser of two evils. It was believed that emigration could offer new opportunities that would be unavailable in their homeland, and for many this was likely the case. The most prolific advocate of child immigration in Scotland, of course, was William Quarrier, who established a home in Glasgow for orphan and destitute boys in 1871 with the intention of preparing them for emigration. And he would send his first group of emigrants to Canada, numbering 64 in 1872. Advertisements promoting child migration depicted the destinations as lands of milk and honey, with social and economic prosperity endowed on those who crossed the Atlantic. And images contrasted the children's experiences in a dark and fetid urban centre with the wide open spaces that would be found through emigration. The images you can see here, slightly obscured by the text, show very visible rickets, bare feet, and these are images associated with the narrative of facts, which is the magazine produced by William Quarrier. We also see smaller local Scottish institutions that practice child emigration, often through the likes of Quarrier. So, for instance, this image is from the Stirling Winwell home. Just to finish up here. Historians have, of course, played a fundamental role in shifting the narrative surrounding child immigration, not only to include the voices of children, but to prioritise them. And we see children's testimonies refracted through promotional literature, newspaper reports, and so forth, that have allowed us to understand the suffering that child migrants would experience. The land of promise heralded here was, for many, one, of course, of ostracization and hardship. Societies both resented and abused the cheap labour that children represented. So finally here, what I've hoped to do today in this short talk is to think about the complex legacy that Scotland has in relation to child poverty. We've certainly seen an underappreciation of the importance of Scottish figures, particularly Sheriff Watson and Thomas Guthrie, and their initiatives to respond to child poverty. And I think it's also worth thinking about what do we learn about Scottish society in the 19th century through a focus on poor children. And I think part of the answer here relates to Scottish religious culture and the impact of the disruption during this period as well. So that's something perhaps worth thinking about. But I welcome any questions that you have.
Thank you very much. That was really interesting, and I'm someone who has a keen interest in social history, and there is so much in that I did not know, because I don't think there's the same maybe knowledge about the Scottish side of it. I think when you kind of get access to a lot of information, it's much more kind of, I guess, UK wide, but predominantly I feel more focused probably on England. So there was so much within that I'd never been aware of before. So thank you very much. Hopefully it was similar for other people. So yes, okay, yeah, Robin's got our first question. So I find it interesting that there are such detailed medical records from the early 20th century. Is this usual for medical records of the time, or due to a particular interest in causes of pediatric mortality?
Ooh, that's an excellent question. I think part of the key component there. So if it some of the medical records I suppose I was talking about were kind of more 19th century, relating to child labour, and this was an area of great debate. So the perils and the problems of child labour was something that was articulated and disagreed about vehemently within Parliament. So we have investigations into the conditions within particular industries. It was often on an industry by industry basis. So that's where a lot of the data comes from. And then, of course, when you have the Education Acts, all of a sudden, when you have compulsory education and all of the children are in school, you have a lot more access to data relating to well-being. Some historians talk about it being almost like a great laboratory, that all of a sudden you've got a sense of children's height and weight and diet and dental records. So actually, yes, the 19th century, we do have a prolific amount of data from various different sources on children's well-being.
Thank you. I was wondering, towards the beginning of the talk, you spoke about when you were mentioning the kind of windows and the one-room dwelling, and you said at the turn, we kind of entered into the First World War, the contrast between like Scotland and England was really quite stark. Why do you think it was so significant at that point?
That's a really good question. And in all honesty, I'm not very sure. A lot of the literature talks about the tenements were particularly ill-suited. It was particularly difficult to kind of accommodate people. In England, some of the buildings had, basement that you had kind of basement dwellings that happened in some English cities, and that often wasn't something that happened in Scotland. So that's a different problem. That was often associated with damp and so forth. But tenement dwellings were particularly ill-suited in terms of facilities, toilets, and so forth. It was very difficult to create an outhouse when you're in a big dwelling. And of course, if you just go on a tour in Edinburgh, you'll hear the kind of ghost stories and the Gardyloo, and all of that is part of the city's history. The problem of waste, sanitary problems, because it was very difficult to have access to sanitary bathrooms and toilets and so forth. Whereas in some other cities, perhaps the houses kind of lent themselves to that more. I don't know if that's answering your question at all. I think also the kind of economic situation in Scotland as well, the impact of the Highland clearances, the impact of Irish immigration and so forth. While you have some of that in England, it's more stark and perhaps more felt within a Scottish context. But you could easily look at just the English situation and it's terrible, and then you compare it with Scotland, which is much more terrible. So yeah, the comparison between the two is quite stark.
Yeah, I think it's all what you kind of just touched on there, of the kind of the rural poverty, because I think as well, like for me, when you think of poverty, like child poverty within like the 19th century, 20th century, you do kind of automatically think of like Glasgow tenements, like the big industrial cities and the kind of problems that connect with that. But that picture you said that really was quite evocative of the house with the kind of the little children in front of it barefoot, and it is poverty, but in a kind of different sense. And like you said, I think Scotland's history and the kind of unique history that we have in Scotland, there's a whole different kind of type of poverty associated with children who are living out with the kind of big industrial settings as well. Thank you. There's a couple more questions. So at one point you talked about children being fed and educated and then sent home to live within the family. I wonder if a similar practice could help in the present climate with so many families facing poverty and food banks. At least if children are all fed, as a general rule, it takes away the stigma. So I guess that's kind of more of a kind of comment. Thank you, June, on things just now as well. There's another question.
Just speaking to that comment, I mentioned in passing that, William Watson did not want to be known as a ragged school. He hated the term ragged. And there was a really intense debate within the ragged school movement as to whether to change the name because of this idea of stigma, that marking these children out as ragged children. And of course, this is often the kind of discussion you'll have when you talk about having certain children getting free school meals. What kind of stigma does that do? But the decision ultimately was to keep the name ragged, that it kind of marked the sphere of influence. But it was this idea of stigma, the stigma of poverty, was something that was hugely debated then as to whether the name undermined the cause. And I think there are parallels with discussions today for how we treat children within schools that perhaps need a bit of extra help. I think that's a perceptive thought here from June.
Yeah, definitely. So our next question is, was there anything for the rural poor children corresponding to the ragged schools? For example, the children that were in the black houses?
Right, so that is a good question. So ragged schools were generally formed within any community where child poverty and juvenile delinquency, of course, the two go hand in hand, where that was deemed a problem. But you would need the kind of local do-gooder and volunteers. Generally the teachers were volunteers. However, of course, within a Scottish context, we've got the parish schools, which you could go to freely if paid for by the parish. But of course, in many of these communities, they were vastly overstretched. And of course, it would be the poorest children who would miss out first. And of course, there was talking about stigma. There was the issue around children who didn't feel they were presentable. And of course, children working and supporting their families. So actually, I think it was very difficult to kind of catch all of the children within a community. You would always have children working. And for that reason, a lot of ragged schools, especially in England, a lot of ragged schools only had children in the evening. And that, of course, is part of the Aberdeen system, is this idea of having children all day and feeding them, which was quite different from the English way of doing things. So in terms of rural poor children, it might be that there were the odd school here and there, but often they've not left any sources. These schools kind of pop up and disappear. They often didn't have a school building. They would meet in a barn or in someone's house or a disused factory or something. So actually, it's quite often impossible to get a sense of the real scale of the ragged school movement. But as I say, you needed the numbers in terms of volunteers.
Thank you. Our next question is, how did the ragged schools relate to the ones set up by the Society for the Propagation of Christian Knowledge and later when the Education Act came into force?
But this is an excellent question, and there's a bit of crossover here with the question from Susan, and I think part of the answer to this is I as I've kind of just hinted at, it's often difficult to get a sense of the scale of ragged schools within particular communities. I think within Scotland, certainly there's ragged schools in Dundee, Tain, Greenock, Helensburgh, but they tend to be within industrial areas. So when we're talking about the Society for the Propagation of Christian Knowledge and their schools, especially in the Highlands, I wonder actually if they had kind of the main market there, if that makes sense, in the Highlands. I'm not sure really whether the ragged schools had a presence there. I don't know. But when the Education Act came about, that essentially is kind of the end of the ragged school mission for some. They kind of carry on and see themselves as kind of mopping up almost. They kind of change their mission, focusing a bit more on, children perhaps with physical disabilities. But the Education Act, when that comes in, and particularly when education becomes free, which doesn't happen immediately, the ragged schools kind of limp along and peter out gradually. Does that answer your question? I think that should do that.
Hopefully it will be. I was going to ask just myself, just sneaking my own question in, another one. Is there like a point like where you do kind of see in Scotland like a marked shift in the poverty within children? Like when is there, you know, when the acts come in, or the impact of the schools, or after the Second World War, you know, is there a kind of point that really does begin to kind of, I don't know, turn the tide, or is it just that kind of gradual chipping away? And I know there's child poverty still today.
Exactly, yes. I think that's a really difficult question because child poverty absolutely still exists today. But I would say the kind of we see legislation come hard and fast when it comes to the end of the 19th century, beginning of the 20th century, and it becomes a government problem rather than the problem, a local problem. And I think that does make a very big difference in identifying it as something with that there's a kind of a national duty to respond to. So, you know, particularly when we have the kind of turn into the 20th century, things like the provision of free school meals, I think that all makes a significant dent on child poverty. But as you say, it doesn't eliminate it by any means. And certainly during kind of wartime, we've got kind of child poverty very much kind of increasingly visible during wartime, particularly with when it comes to kind of clothing and this kind of thing. But I would say that the turn into the 20th century does mark a really important period of change.
Thank you. I think we've kind of have asked if there is any final questions, if there are any final questions. But if there are not, we can maybe kind of conclude that there nicely on the hour. So yeah, thank you very, very much for taking the time to present and answer our questions today. And thank you very much to everyone for coming along as well. There's some thank yous coming already saying thank you for an excellent talk. I learned a lot and also found it very moving, which I think is very true. Yes, so yeah, thank yous all around, and I hope that people enjoy the rest of their evenings. I know we've got someone joining us from the US, Susan, so enjoy the rest of your kind of day, and yeah, hopefully we'll see everyone at another talk soon. So thank you.
Great, thank you very much. Thank you for coming.